Hi everybody, Dr. Pellegrino here again. I really apologize about the confusion with the last upload. I'm just re-recording the lecture again. This will be the third time. And what I'm going to do from here on out is post videos to YouTube. And this way, if Haiku is still not up, you can just check my YouTube page and you guys can actually do discussion comments and have a discussion board in the comment section of YouTube. So I'm hoping that works. We'll see. This is my YouTube page. I will send the links in the emails that I send you guys out. I already uploaded a couple to or one video for my APUSH kids, and now I'm doing one for the CPE classes as well. So today's lesson is going to be centered on the usage of the atomic bomb, and we're going to look at the end of the war and kind of pick up where we left off last time with Japan kind of girding for Armageddon, as one historian puts it, just refusing to surrender even though Japan had been soundly defeated on the battlefield for 3 long years. Okay, so in order to do that, we're going to begin with the Manhattan Project. Manhattan Project, as you probably remember from our bingo game, was the code name for the construction of the atomic bomb. That was successful in late July 17th of 1945. It was led by this guy right here. This is blocked out here, but his name is J. Robert Oppenheimer. He was the lead physicist behind this. The whole project got started when Albert Einstein, who was himself a European, specifically German Jew, was forced out of Germany during the Nazi reign. And he wrote a letter to President Roosevelt saying that they have this idea of how to split an atomic or how to split an atom, and that can create untold power. And if it's unleashed and used by the Nazis, that will be a game changer. This was something that terrified Einstein. And he wrote this letter to FDR, and FDR decided to put together the best physicists and engineers and chemists in the United States and really throughout the world, and got them all together working on different parts of this project. And took over 3.5 years, but the United States was the first country to develop an atomic weapon. It was called Trinity. It was launched in the middle of nowhere, Mexico, a place called Alamogordo. And then these 2 bombs were the ones that were actually dropped over the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. All right, little boy and fat man. This is the uranium bomb. This is the plutonium bomb. The point that you need to understand is that they both go boom. All right, I mean, they are really totally different types of weapons than anything humanity had ever unleashed before. We'll actually look at the consequences of that in a moment. So this was a huge project. The United States was the first country to do this. Other countries had their own Manhattan projects, but we figured it out first, and that's one of the reasons why we won the war in the Pacific. Right. Leading up to this time, the United States decided to drop what are called LeMay leaflets. So you probably don't recall, but I mentioned Curtis LeMay during the last lecture. He was the guy that organized and designed the Tokyo firebombing raid, which was so successful from an American perspective. Even though it killed 100,000 people, that was the point. I mean, the point was to sow destruction into the heart of the Japanese Empire. And Curtis LeMay decided that if he was going to continue firebombing these cities, they should at least receive some kind of warning ahead of time. So pause the video here and read these, what they're called LeMay leaflets, which were dropped over the cities like Hiroshima just a few days before the use of that bomb, which was August 6th. We dropped it August 6th. And this was dropped July 29th. About 750,000 of these little leaflets were dropped. So pause the video here and read through this. So now that you've done that, you see that the United States is giving specific reasons for why we wanted to use these leaflets. It's the first time ever in human history that any country was telling its enemy to leave, citing humanitarian policies. Right? The goal wasn't to actually kill people. The goal was to convince the Japanese decision makers to end the war. And LeMay was a really smart guy. He decided to make these leaflets, so this is the actual text that says this, make these leaflets look like money. So this was the same color scheme and size of the money that was used in Japan at the time. So when we were dropping it, we wanted to make sure people were picking up these messages. Because if you see money on the street, you probably reach down and grab it. The Hiroshima bombing itself was pretty brutal. I'm going to show you a clip now of that bombing. It's about a 4-minute video, and it's designed to show you just how terrible this kind of weapon actually was.
I saw an aircraft, like a tiny silver drop, entering the sky above Hiroshima. I instantly recognized it as an American plane, as no Japanese aircraft could fly at that altitude at the time. It was just one plane, so I assumed that it was passing by as usual.
I was counting. 1, 2, 3.
I was wiping the desktop. That was when the bomb was dropped.
It took about 45 seconds from the time the bomb left the airplane until it exploded. And I think there wasn't a man in the airplane that wasn't either timing it with his watch or counting or doing something. I was sure the bomb was a dud. I was sure it wasn't going to work.
After falling for 43 seconds, the time and barometric triggers started the firing mechanism. A uranium bullet fired down a barrel into a uranium target. Together, they started a nuclear chain reaction. Solid matter began to come apart, releasing untold quantities of energy.
Okay, so that's obviously just a reenactment. We do have footage of it. You can YouTube it later and try to find actual footage of it. It's not as clear, obviously, and it's been black and white because it was 1945. But we do have footage of the actual bombings of both Hiroshima and Nagasaki. again, the point here is to show you the humanitarian loss here. Right? These are the survivors. So these are the lucky ones. This woman had some kind of pattern on her dress, which was burned into her skin, permanently burned. Right? This little boy had the hair on the side of his head, which was obviously facing the fireball, syringed. So, and the truth is, these people are pretty likely to die in the first couple of weeks afterwards from radiation poisoning, which would cause a rapidly accelerating form of cancer. All told, you're looking at something like 70,000 people were killed in the initial fire burst, which was detonated about somewhere between a quarter and a half a mile above the ground. The next 2 weeks saw a similar number of people killed. So historians use a number somewhere between 120 and 140 or 150,000 people who were killed during the Hiroshima attack. The Nagasaki attack, which I'm not going to talk too much about, was a little bit less successful, even though the bomb was actually 25% more powerful. It didn't reach anywhere near its target because of cloud coverage, but the pilot did not want to land with that bomb loaded and just, kill tens of thousands of American soldiers at the Air Force or the Navy base. So he dropped the bomb into basically the side of a mountain, and the mountain absorbed a lot of the blast. So the Nagasaki attack 3 days later killed something like 40,000 people, and then about another 30 or so thousand people over the course of the next couple of weeks. Right? From an American perspective, this is an enormous victory. It achieved its goal because it's showing the Japanese people that their government has let them down. Right? We had dropped these leaflets telling them that we were going to do that. About 350,000 people lived in Hiroshima before these leaflets were dropped. Not many left. They truly believed that their government would protect them, which makes it even more sad because their government had no capability to protect them at this time. Right? So here's the devastation afterwards. Right? The historical point that I want to make is that these weapons never even would have been used if the Japanese had simply surrendered earlier in the war. They had lost every single battle for 3+ years, and they just continued. And we're not talking about close losses. We're talking about the Japanese losing somewhere between 3 and 10 times as many Americans in every single battle. There's no indication that they were going to be able to turn it around. But again, surrender was simply not an option because of this concept of the Ketsugo, of the samurai, of the Bushido code that saw honor as more important than life. It's better to die honorably than to live and surrender. That's the mindset of the Japanese government and military. Maybe not necessarily the regular people, what we call the rank and file, although there were fanatical people who were just regular citizens in Japan too. But the people who were making decisions were not stopping the war for that reason. Here's another picture showing the before and after of Hiroshima. Right? Before, you see a city, you see dwellings, buildings. Right? Afterwards, just nothing. It's just completely flat. There's nothing there. Looks like a desert with a couple of roads and a river. See the river here? A river right here going through it. So the city was utterly devastated. So this brings us to the central question: were the A-bombs necessary? Right? Were they necessary to draw the Japanese to surrender? Were they moral? Was this something that the United States should have done or should not have done from a moral perspective? We're going to unpack all these questions together, but you're going to do actually a lot of this on your own. So I want you to go into haiku. And first things first, I want you to watch these 2 videos. First, this is about a 2-minute video. Was the atomic bomb necessary? And there's a couple of discussion questions. You don't have to write them out or answer them, but you should know the answers to them. right? And these will help you with your DBQ that we'll do sometime next week or the week after, probably the end of next week. More on that later. And then I want you to watch this video, which asks a very similar question and comes to a very different conclusion. So as you guys know, I always try to show you multiple perspectives within history. And we're going to do the same thing with this case, right? So take a moment, log into Haiku if you're not already there, and watch these two videos. It'll take you about 10 minutes. So just pause the lecture right now and then come back to me when you're done. So now that you've completed that, I want you to do one more thing, right? And you guys are free to use these as discussion topics, right? To talk about the pros and cons of anything or any point that they're making in these videos. And then I want you to use this link, right? Atomic Bomb Slides, what we call Atomic Bomb Flipped Classroom, which is kind of a joke considering what we're doing with the online learning right now. But I want you to click on that and it'll bring you to this. Okay, and then these slides that I've posted for you guys. Ooh, who's on? Somebody's on. Ryan's on. Hi, Ryan. So one of the things I want you to do is I want you to basically read through each of these slides. And I have notes here and here. And what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to give you guys an understanding of what was going on behind the scenes in Japan as the end of the war was unfolding. Because the central questions that we're going to ask here are, especially this first one, was Japan really willing to surrender? Right? Were they willing to surrender at the end of the war by August 6th? Because if they were, if Japan was willing to surrender, and we used that horrible weapon that I just showed you, then that would make the United States not too different from our enemies, from the Japanese fascists who were slaughtering innocent Chinese and Koreans and Filipinos, not too different from the Nazis who were slaughtering innocent Jews and Gypsies and Slavs. So this is a really important question to figure out. If the answer is yes, they were willing to surrender, then the question becomes, what was surrender going to look like? Are they defining surrender in a way that would seem acceptable to you and me, and especially the Allied forces, the policymakers in the United States, in the UK, in England, in Australia, for that matter, of the other Allied nations? Then we're going to look at whether or not not whether or not, but who or what authority is making that kind of decision. And so who's making the decision to surrender? Do they have a president? Do they have a government that functions as we do? So I'll have more to say about that in a moment. Next, once we have the answers to these questions, then we can actually unpack this question right here. Was the use of the bombs morally justifiable? Right, and that'll be something along the lines of what your DBQ question will be on. Right? In order to answer this question, though, we need to know what the alternatives were. So imagine a world without the atomic bomb. Would that have been better? Would it have saved lives if we didn't use the atomic bomb? Because if we didn't use it, maybe the war would have lasted another 2 months or 3 months or 6 months or a year. And people were dying every day, a lot of people. But were as many people dying as were killed in those 2 atomic attacks? That's another question as well. So how do these alternatives compare to the bombs? Should we have used it based on what the other available options were at that time? As you read through these slides, you will glean the answers to all of these questions. It should probably take you about 15 minutes to read through all of these slides. Before you do, I just have one more thing to add. This is their government. Okay, this is what we call the Big Six. These are the 6 policymakers who are choosing or not choosing to continue the war. The guy in the middle, that's the emperor. His last name is Hirohito. Emperor Hirohito was not technically a member of the government, but he was the most powerful person by far in all of Japan. And the truth is, if he wanted to end the war, he could have won the war. These people more or less would have listened to him, right? With a couple of exceptions. This guy, definitely not so much. This guy, not so much. But the others would have. Finally, as I have written down here, all 6 must agree if they're going to if they're going to exit the war. So if 5 of the 6 say, yeah, we're defeated, we need to surrender, they still can't, because it has to be a unanimous decision. So it's very dissimilar to our government, where we have majority rules. They didn't have that. All members of their inner cabinet needed to agree in order to end the war. So that's going to be an important part of the calculus as well, figuring out which ones were and which ones were not willing to end the war. So I'll just kind of give you a sneak peek. This guy right here, Tojo, he winds up being the most reasonable of all. He is going to be saying, like, listen, we need to get out of this war. There's no way we can do that. And he thinks Russia is going to be the answer to that. He thinks by appealing to the Soviet Union, they can have more favorable peace terms in order to end the war. Okay, so I'm going to pause the video here as well. Well, you're going to pause the video here as well, and you're going to read through each of these slides. It should take you about 15 minutes. You don't have to read all of the Potsdam Declaration, but you're welcome to do so. Let's see if there's anything else. We need additional explanation. Thank you. Okay. So if you guys have any specific questions, the comments might be a good place to do that. So pause the video here and read through these slides. Okay, so you should be caught up by now, and you should have kind of gleaned these conclusions from the last point, right? Those who argue that Japan was willing or ready to surrender only look at what's called the one condition offer, right? And they don't understand that there's just no way that American policymakers would have agreed to that, right? So if you look at that offer, give me one second. Here it is. Their conditions for peace would have been not really peace, right? Peace meant they get to keep their emperor, they get to keep their military, keep their air force, keep their navy, keep their army, keep all of the branches of their military intact. They got to choose if any of the generals should be prosecuted for war crimes, for the 16 million innocent people that they had bayoneted to death. And by the way, that just to be clear, that means there were no war crimes trials for people in Japan, that they did nothing wrong. And it meant that no Allied powers, and especially not the United States, could occupy Japan. So after the war was over, we couldn't come in and try to reform their government. So that should not sound like surrender to you. That should sound like Japan's just wishing that America would leave and forget the whole thing ever happened. But that's just not the way war works. When you lose a war, you have to pay consequences. You have to pay reparations. You need to change your government. The policymakers need to be held responsible for what happened. And that's just the way it is. But Japan was even after the second bomb, they were still thinking that the United States would actually accept this kind of ridiculous peace offer. Just totally ridiculous, and honestly insulting as well. So that's the point that I wanted to draw here, right? The critics, like that first video that I showed you from Al Jazeera, they only rely on American estimates of when the Japanese would surrender, not the actual decisions by the Japanese. And that's what I hope to have shown you here, is the actual meeting minutes and the quotations and the diaries from the people who were making the decisions in Japan at the time. There was no indication that they were really willing to do that. And because of that, the morality of the bombing should be clear if, and there's a big if you value human life, if you value Japanese lives, if you value American lives, if you value Chinese lives, because the bombs were only a part of a larger strategy that ultimately saved, indeed, millions of lives. And I'll show you how we know that now. And so here's the last slide. So if you look at the two options, on the one hand, you have a world with no atomic bomb. A world with no atomic bomb, we think probably would have ended the war sometime around November 1st. And the way we would have done that is through a strategy called blockade and bombardment. Let me see if I can show you blockade. An image of that. This isn't the best one, but the idea is to do something like this. So this is actually a different area. Here's Japan proper. The idea is to surround the islands and make sure that no shipments can get in or out of Japan. And Japan relied on its conquered territories for something close to half, about 40 to 45% of all of their food. So the blockade is a really important strategy for us because the Japanese are going to literally starve to death over time. And that was precisely what was happening. The food rations were so low that many Japanese were starving to death. So if you think about your own diet, the American diet or the world's diet is supposed to be something like 2,000 calories each day is a healthy amount of food. But the truth is, we Americans eat a lot more than that, especially you guys, because you're still young and growing and your brains are developing and you're getting strong. You probably eat something closer to 2,500. If you're on a sport, you probably eat 3,000. And if you're a bigger person, you probably eat close to 3,500 or more. So if you're active and you're a bigger person, you probably eat 3,500, maybe 4,000. When I was in college and I was running like 100 miles a week, I was eating about 4,000 calories per day, and I didn't weigh much. So that's a normal diet, somewhere between like 2,500 and 3,500 calories per day, depending on the person. To give you an idea of what that means, if you eat a package of Pop Tarts, so s'mores Pop Tarts are my favorite kind of Pop Tarts. If I have one package of Pop Tarts, not a box, just a package, the two Pop Tarts, that's about 400 calories, about 450 calories, depending on the flavor. If it's blueberry or it's cherry, it'll be a little bit less. The Japanese at this time were down to just under 800 calories per day. Think about that. That's 2 packages of Pop-Tarts per day. That's what they were eating. That's what they were forced to live off of. But they would have actually been lucky to get Pop-Tarts because the types of food that they were exposed to weren't really food. They were eating tree bark. They were eating dried locusts. They were eating what their government called meat substitutes and fillers. So it wasn't real food as we understand it. It was insects. It was processed foods that were coming, like I said, from tree barks. So the caloric intake had almost no nutritional value either. And this is why tens of thousands of Japanese had already starved by the end of World War II, by the late summer of 1945. So it's expected that if the war would have continued until November 1st, which was the date of what we called our Operation Coronet. I'm not going to get into it right now, but that's kind of the earliest date that any historian suggests the war would have ended without the use of the bombs. You're talking about 2 to 3 million Japanese, innocent Japanese, just like those who died in Hiroshima, just like those who died in Nagasaki, innocent Japanese, regular citizens. 2 to 3 million would have died. Okay. In addition to that, outside of Japan, something between 600,000 and a million Chinese, Filipinos, Koreans, and other Asian peoples would have died as well. So, somewhere between 100 and 200,000 Chinese were being still bayoneted, slaughtered every month in the summer of 1945. So even though Japan was losing the war at home, they did not slow down their genocide of the Chinese people abroad. Right? Their lives are just as innocent as these people's lives over here, just as the Japanese people over here's lives are just as innocent as those in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In addition to that, the final point here is that the Russian invasion of Manchuria, which occurred the same day as the Nagasaki bomb, the 9th of August, that would have killed something like 700,000 civilians in the first couple of months of the war. In the first week, indeed, it killed 118,000 people in the first 7 days of the Russian invasion of Manchuria. Right, so in total, you're looking at somewhere between 3.3 to 4.7 million civilian deaths if you add up the Japanese from here and here, and you add up the people that the Japanese soldiers were killing at that time as well. So that's the number that you had to have to deal with. On the other hand, you have the use of the bombs. You have what actually happened in real life. There, the war ended the 15th of August. We know what happened in Hiroshima. We know what happened in Nagasaki. And I just explained what happened in Manchuria. You add up all of these deaths, you're looking at 330,000 innocent people who were killed. There is no third column. There is no column that says pixie dust, where we can just sprinkle some pixie dust over the islands of Japan, and then on the day before the Hiroshima bombing, and then the Japanese wake up and say, "Oh, you know, we should have surrendered a long time ago." But that's not an option. There is no pixie dust. You either use the bombs or you have this, and these are very conservative estimates of what's happening at this time. Right. So this is why it's not really a tenable position to say that using the bombs was wrong. If you value human life, which I assume most of us do, or all of us do, then you should think that the use of atomic bombs, while tragic for these people right here, was actually a blessing for these people whose lives were saved. And that's one of the main points of today's lecture. Right. The final point I'll make here is the starvation. The United States sent over over 1,000,000 tons, not 1,000,000 pounds, 1,000,000 tons of food in the first couple of months after the war was over, in order to get the Japanese as much food as they possibly could, because there was a starvation crisis over there. And General MacArthur, he was the leader, he was the main commander in the Pacific Theater. He recognized what was happening. As soon as the American Marines landed on Japan and we saw how bad their starvation was, we sent over almost 1,000,000 tons of food to try to nourish them back to health. Tens of thousands still died after the war ended because they were simply too sickly in order to recover from their starvation diets over the previous couple of years. But we saved millions of lives by rushing them foodstuffs. Okay. All right. Final point we're going to make here for the lecture is VJ Day, which was celebrated on the 15th of August, 1949. I just went over why they surrendered. It was a combination of the atomic bombs on one hand and the Russian invasion on the other. Your book probably goes into detail about this. I know Mr. Green went into this as well. The Russian invasion into Manchuria was a really important part of this because it shows that the Ketsugo strategy is just not viable. It's just not viable. There's no way that they can continue to push the United States patients if the United States is no longer having to share the full burden of the Japanese kamikaze raids. The Russians themselves were going to be involved here too, right? This is a picture from VJ Day. It's an iconic picture in American history. You can see this drunken soldier and celebrating in Times Square once he got home. His friends are kind of laughing in the background. See this, what looks like a nurse. She's not actually a nurse, but she looks like a nurse based on her dress. Her friends over here are laughing in the background as well. This is probably the most famous picture from the war. It was a big party celebration. The sailor wanted to thank a nurse because nurses had saved his own life and his buddies during these kamikaze attacks. So the first one they saw, he just kind of ran up to her and planted a big fat one on her. And some photographer was here to take a picture of it. If he did this today, he'd be in jail for sexual harassment. But in 1945, the context was very, very different, And what's really neat is that the photojournalist that took the shot actually tracked down this guy and this woman and had them meet one another not too many years ago when they were in their 70s or 80s. And they sat down, they had lunch, and they just talked about their own experiences because they didn't know each other. And once he did this, 2 seconds later, he's off and walking around, and he's getting another drink, and he's having a good time. All right. So that's where we're going to end the lecture. We'll do one more lecture tomorrow, which will be on the consequences, the long-term consequences of this war. What I'd like to do is give you guys your test on the European theater on haiku on Monday, but haiku is so unreliable. I'm not sure if we can do that. So be proactive. I'll talk to you more about it tomorrow when I put up the lecture tomorrow, but be proactive this week and review your notes for the European theater. I'll probably do a haiku test, and then after that, I'll have you guys do some kind of an online DBQ. I still haven't quite figured out how that's going to happen. I assume I would use Haiku's assessment tool for that as well. All right, so I'm going to try to put this on YouTube, and then you guys are welcome to use the comment section to create your own discussion board. If you want to use the haiku discussion board, you're welcome to do that as well. All right, guys. See you next time.